The city of Babylon did not scream when it died. It was too busy laughing. It was the night of October the 12th, 539 years before the Common Era, and the air inside the greatest metropolis on earth smelled of roasted ox, stale wine, and the sweat of 1,000,000 men who believed they were gods. The walls of Babylon were not merely stone. They were a geological assertion of dominance, 300 feet high and 80 feet thick, a man-made mountain range that strangled the horizon. Chariot races were held upon their summits, the thunder of hooves drowning out the prayers of the poor below. To the citizens of this golden cage, the world outside was a graveyard of lesser nations, a dust bowl where empires went to die. But Babylon was eternal. The Euphrates River flowed directly through its heart, a liquid artery that guaranteed the city could never be sieged, never be starved, never be conquered. They had water, they had grain stored for 20 years, they had the gods of the deep and the gods of the high places. They had forgotten the definition of fear. Inside the great palace, King Belshazzar sat at the head of the universe, drunk on hubris and a vintage red wine that stained his beard like fresh blood. He was not just a king. Tonight he was a blasphemer. The banquet hall was a cavern of blue-glazed brick and gold leaf filled to the brim with 1,000 lords, their wives, and their concubines. The noise was a physical weight, a cacophony of lyres, drums, and the shrieking laughter of men who thought they were untouchable. Belshazzar, eyes swimming in a haze of intoxication, stood up. He swayed, his golden robes catching the flicker of 10,000 oil lamps. He wanted more than a party. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to spit in the face of the divine. "Bring them out!" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip over the heads of the revelers. "Bring the vessels of the Hebrew God. Let us drink from the cups of the vanquished." The servants, terrified and trembling, scurried into the vaults. They returned carrying the sacred treasures of Jerusalem, the golden goblets, the silver basins, the holy vessels looted from the temple of Solomon by his father Nebuchadnezzar. These were items consecrated for the service of the one God, objects that had once held the blood of sacrifice and the water of purification. Now they were toys for a drunken despot. Belshazzar grabbed a heavy golden chalice, feeling the cold metal against his feverish skin. He poured the dark, intoxicating wine into it, the liquid swirling like a dark omen. He raised it high, the gold glinting in the torchlight. "To the gods of gold," he screamed, spilling wine onto the mosaic floor. "To the gods of silver, to the gods of iron, wood, and stone, to the gods we can touch, not the invisible ghosts of our enemies." The crowd erupted. It was a symphony of mockery. They drank from the holy cups, wiping their mouths with the silk of their robes, laughing at the silence of the heavens. They toasted to Marduk, to Nabu, to Ishtar. They laughed at the Persians gathering outside their walls like wolves in the winter. Let Cyrus and his armies rot in the sun. Let them stare at the impregnable Ishtar gate with its blue dragons and lions and despair. What could a Persian barbarian do against the geometry of the gods? Belshazzar drained the cup, the wine burning his throat, the rush of power intoxicating him more than the alcohol. He felt invincible. He felt like a deity striding across the stars. He did not know that 2 miles upstream, away from the lights and the music, the geography of the world was being rewritten by engineers. Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, stood in the mud and darkness, the cool night air biting at his skin. He did not believe in magic. He believed in mechanics. He did not believe in unbreachable walls. He believed in human error. For weeks his army hadn't been preparing for a siege. They had been digging. They had excavated massive canals in secret, hidden by the curvature of the land and the arrogance of the Babylonians who never bothered to look. Their plan bordered on insanity. They were going to steal the river. At Cyrus's signal, a torch waved in the black distance. The final dam was broken. The river groaned. It was a low terrestrial sound, like the earth itself was in pain. The water, confused and heavy, rushed into the new cut, diverting away from the city. Under the massive walls of Babylon, the water level began to drop. It went from chest high to waist high, from waist high to knee high. The moat that made Babylon untouchable, the liquid shield that had protected them for centuries, was vanishing. The riverbed, slick with centuries of slime and mud, began to appear. It was a highway, a dark, wet, stinking highway that led straight into the belly of the beast. "Now," Cyrus whispered. He did not shout. History does not need to shout. General Gobryas, the commander of the Gutium, stepped into the mud. Behind him, the Persian Immortals, the deadliest infantry in the ancient world, followed. 10,000 men moved in absolute silence. No armor clinked. No orders were barked. They had wrapped their boots in rags to muffle their steps. They were shadows moving through the arteries of a dying animal. They walked toward the water gates, the iron bars that extended down into the river to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. These gates should have been locked. It was the law. It was the primary defense. But tonight was a festival. Tonight was the night of the heavy wine. The guards were not at their posts. They were either drunk in the taverns or asleep in the guardhouses, dreaming of gold. The gates were wide open. It was the fatal error of a dying empire. The Persians didn't storm Babylon, they flowed into it. They pulled themselves up the slippery banks and onto the stone quays. They moved like a virus entering a bloodstream. The city was so vast, so sprawling, that the outer districts were being silently secured while the center was still dancing. The first throats were cut in the dark alleys near the river. There were no screams, only the wet gurgle of dying men and the soft thud of bodies hitting the earth. The Persians secured the squares. They blocked the exits. They set small, controlled fires to herd the panic toward the palace. The smoke began to rise, choking the stars, mixing with the incense of the feast. Back in the banquet hall, the blasphemy had reached its fever pitch. Belshazzar was laughing at a jester when the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of it. The noise didn't taper off. It was severed. A silence so violent, so absolute, that it felt like a physical blow to the chest. The musicians stopped playing. The dancers stopped spinning. The wine goblets paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the room, driven by an instinct they couldn't name, turned to the southern wall of the palace. The plaster there was white and smooth, illuminated by the central lampstand. But now it began to change. A hand appeared, not a projection, not a trick of the light, not a shadow. It was the fingers of a man's hand, disembodied, floating in the stagnant air, glowing with a terrifying spectral light that cast no shadows. The wrist faded into nothingness, but the fingers were solid, deliberate, and terrifyingly real. Belshazzar dropped the goblet. The sound of the gold hitting the stone floor rang out like a funeral bell, echoing in the deadly silence. His face, flushed with wine a moment ago, turned the color of ash. His knees knocked together, a loud, pathetic rhythm of fear that every lord in the room could hear. The physiological betrayal of a man whose soul has just been evicted from his body. The fingers moved. They didn't write with ink. They carved. They dug into the stone plaster with the screeching sound of metal on bone. Dust fell from the wall. The sound was unbearable, a grinding, tearing noise that made teeth ache. Letters formed, strange, jagged, burning letters, many, tekel, a parson. The hand vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the words burning on the wall like a scar on the skin of reality. "Get the magicians!" Belshazzar screamed, his voice a high-pitched squeak, stripped of all royalty. "Get the enchanters, the Chaldeans. Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck. He shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." They came running, the wise men of Babylon, the astrologers who mapped the stars, the soothsayers who read sheep livers. They stared at the wall, they squinted, they murmured, sweat poured down their faces. They saw the letters, but the meaning was locked. The wisdom of Babylon was blind. The gods they had toasted were silent. The room began to fill with a panic that smelled like sour sweat. The king was hyperventilating, clawing at his throne. Then the queen, mother, hearing the commotion, entered the banquet house. She looked at the terrified men with disdain. "O king, live forever," she said, her voice steady. "Do not let your thoughts trouble you. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom were found in him. Call Daniel. Daniel, the Hebrew exile, the man who had refused the king's meat and the king's wine. He was brought in. He was an old man now, his hair white, but his back was straight, and his eyes held the weight of a storm. He walked into the circle of terrified pagans and looked at the shivering king with a mixture of pity and judgment. He did not bow, he did not tremble. "I have heard of you," Belshazzar stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the wall, "that the spirit of the gods is in you. Read this, interpret this, and I will give you gold, I will give you power." Daniel looked at the gold chain in the king's hand and shook his head. "Keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to another," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." He took a step closer to the throne, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne. He was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men. Daniel paused. The silence was so deep you could hear the torches sputtering. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. Although you knew all this, you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Daniel turned to the burning wall. He raised a hand. This is the inscription that was written, Many, many tekel upharsin. Many, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Belshazzar slumped back onto his throne. It was a death sentence from a ghost. But the human mind is a fortress of denial. He thought he still had time. He thought doom was a distant cloud, a philosophical problem for tomorrow. He ordered them to clothe Daniel in purple and proclaim him the third ruler. He thought the ritual would save him. He thought if he acted like a king, reality would bend. He was wrong. Doom was not distant. Doom was wet, and it was holding a curved sword. While the king was handing out gold chains to prophets, the Persian vanguard had reached the palace gates. The guards at the main entrance saw shadows moving in the torchlight. Before they could draw a breath to scream, arrows took them in the throats. The Persians didn't knock. They brought a battering ram of silence and steel. The great doors of the banquet hall, intricately carved with scenes of hunting lions, burst open, not with a bang, but with the sickening crunch of wood splintering and the wet thud of the outer guards' bodies being thrown inside. The music had been dead for an hour, but now the screaming began. Belshazzar stood up, swaying, his eyes wide. He saw Gobryas standing in the doorway. He saw the Persian soldiers, their wicker shields painted with strange symbols, their eyes hard and devoid of mercy. They were covered in mud, the mud of the Euphrates, the mud that was supposed to protect him. "Defend me!" Belshazzar screamed, drawing a ceremonial sword that was encrusted with jewels but had never tasted blood. "I am the king of Babylon," but his lords were already dying. The Persians moved into the hall like a scythe through wheat. There was no battle here. It was an execution. The floor, sticky with spilled wine, became slick with fresh blood. The smell of roast meat was replaced by the copper tang of slaughter. Tables were overturned. Gold cups rolled in the gore. The concubines huddled in the corners, their screams lost in the din of steel on steel. Belshazzar backed away, retreating toward the very wall where the spectral hand had written his fate. He was trapped between the prophecy and the sword. He looked at the letters, many, tekel, and then he looked at the Persian general advancing on him. He realized in that final, freezing second that the walls hadn't failed. The river hadn't failed. He had failed. He had been weighed. He was light. He was nothing. A Persian spear, thrown with the precision of a thunderbolt, answered his final thought. It took him in the chest, pinning him to the plaster. The king of Babylon slid down the wall, his blood smearing over the word upharsin. He died, staring at the boots of his enemy, his hand still clutching the stolen cup of a god he had mocked. By sunrise, the silence had returned to Babylon, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a new master. Cyrus rode through the Ishtar gate, his white horse stepping carefully over the debris of the old world. He didn't burn the city down. He didn't enslave the populace. He didn't need to destroy what he now owned. He simply walked in and took it. The greatest city in the history of the world had fallen in a single night, without a siege, without a legitimate battle. It fell because it believed it couldn't. It fell because, while it was looking up at the stars and laughing, the enemy was walking underneath the door. The head of gold had been severed. The era of the silver chest and arms had begun, and the Euphrates flowed on indifferent to the names of the kings who claimed to own it. The morning sun did not bring warmth to Babylon. It brought clarification. When the light hit the glazed blue bricks of the Ishtar gate, it revealed a city that had been lobotomized. The citizens, those who had slept through the massacre or hidden in their cellars, emerged into a world that no longer belonged to them. They expected to see their streets running with rivers of blood, their temples burning, their women weeping in chains. That was the way of war. That was the way of Assyria. That was the way of Babylon itself. But what they saw was far more terrifying than destruction. They saw order. The Persian Immortals stood at every major intersection, statues of silent intimidation. They did not loot. They did not rape. They did not burn the libraries. They stood with their wicker shields and their curved Akinakis swords, watching the population with the cold, detached gaze of new landlords. This was not a raid. It was an eviction notice for history. The transition was so surgical, so absolute, that the priests of Marduk were still chanting their morning prayers, unsure if they should be praying for the dead king or the new one. The bureaucracy of the empire hadn't just been conquered, it had been hijacked. Cyrus did not sit on Belshazzar's blood-stained throne immediately. He knew the theater of power. He walked to the great temple of Isegila, the spiritual heart of the city. He did not smash the idols. He did not mock the local gods. He knelt. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By respecting Marduk, he stole him. He told the people of Babylon that their own god had abandoned the corrupt Belshazzar and chosen him, the Persian, to restore order. It was a lie so beautiful that the conquered embraced it. They threw palm branches at the feet of the man who had just slit their empire's throat. But the true shockwave was yet to come. In the dungeons and the ghettos of the city there lived a people who did not bow to Marduk, the exiles of Judah. For 70 years they had wept by the rivers of Babylon, hanging their harps on the willow trees, refusing to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. They were the forgotten debris of Nebuchadnezzar's wars. To the Babylonians, they were slaves. To Cyrus, they were a geopolitical asset. The edict was issued not with a shout, but with a stroke of a clay stylus. Go home. It was a command that reversed gravity. The chains of 70 years snapped not with iron cutters, but with a whisper from the new king. The gold vessels, the very cups Belshazzar had desecrated the night before, the cups that had sealed his doom, were brought out of the treasury. They were not melted down for coin. They were polished. They were handed back to the hands of the Jewish priests. Cyrus, the pagan king, became the shepherd of the Hebrew God. He funded their journey. He gave them timber. He told them to rebuild Jerusalem. The caravans began to form at the gates. It was a scene of biblical surrealism. The captives were walking free, carrying the treasures of their captors, escorted by the soldiers who had conquered their conquerors. As they marched out of the city, leaving the ziggurats behind, they looked back at the walls of Babylon. The great city was still standing, golden and proud, against the desert sky. It looked eternal, but it was already a corpse. Babylon would linger for centuries, slowly bleeding relevance, slowly being suffocated by the shifting sands and the shifting trade routes. But its soul died the moment Belshazzar dropped that cup. The writing on the wall was not just for a king, it was a warning to every superpower that would ever rise. The stone cries out, and the beam out of the timber answers it. Empire is a borrowed coat. Today, the ruins of Babylon are a mound of dust in the Iraqi desert. The wind howls through the broken arches where emperors once thought they were gods. The gold is gone. The laughter is gone. The armies are gone. But the words remain, burning in the collective memory of mankind, a haunting reminder that every wall can be breached, every river can be dried, and every king who thinks he is a god will eventually meet the silence of the grave. The scales are always weighting, and history is heavy. The sun that rose over the ziggurat of Etemenanki 3 days later did not look like the sun of Babylon, it looked like a Persian eye. The transition of power was absolute. The city, which had been a cacophony of commerce and prayer for 1,000 years, was now subjected to the terrifying discipline of the East. The markets reopened, but the currency of conversation had changed from arrogance to survival. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood silent against the smog of the aftermath. These artificial mountains, built by Nebuchadnezzar to cure his wife's homesickness for the green hills of Media, were now just a cruel irony. The pumps that drew water from the Euphrates still churned, a rhythmic heartbeat of a dead empire, feeding exotic plants that didn't know their masters were corpses. Persian soldiers, men who had grown up in the arid highlands, walked through the lush terraces, touching the leaves with calloused fingers, marveling at the botany of decadence. They did not destroy it, they simply occupied it. The gardens became a barracks. The scent of jasmine was overpowered by the smell of unwashed leather and horse manure. In the lower districts, the procession of the gods began. But in reverse, Cyrus ordered the idols of foreign nations, gods stolen by Babylonian kings over centuries of warfare, to be dusted off and prepared for repatriation. It was a logistical operation of theological magnitude. Statues of gold, silver, and basalt were loaded onto carts. The streets were clogged with deities going home. The people of Babylon watched in stunned silence as their trophies were wheeled away. It was a visual dismantling of their history. Every wagon that left the Ishtar gate took a piece of Babylon's soul with it. Daniel, the prophet who had survived the lion's den and the wrath of kings, watched from the window of his high chamber. He was an old man now, his beard white as the wool of a lamb, but his mind was a razor. He saw what the Babylonians could not, that this was not a disaster, but a fulfillment. He held the scroll of Jeremiah in his trembling hands. 70 years, The math was perfect. The clock of God had struck midnight exactly when it was supposed to. He met with Cyrus in the throne room where Belshazzar had died. The blood had been scrubbed from the floor, but the stain on the metaphysical atmosphere remained. Cyrus sat on the throne, not as a conqueror, but as the CEO of the ancient world. "Your God," Cyrus said, his voice echoing in the vast hall, "is the only one who predicted this." Marduk was silent, Nabu was silent, but your Yahweh, he spoke. Cyrus handed Daniel the decree. It was a cylinder of clay, wet and heavy. The Cyrus cylinder. It was the first charter of human rights in history, written not out of kindness, but out of political genius. "Go," the king said. "Take your people, take your vessels, build your temple, and pray for the life of the king." The exodus that followed was not a flight of refugees. It was a march of victory. 42,360 people gathered. They carried the 5,400 vessels of gold and silver. They sang the psalms of ascent. As they walked out of the shadow of the great walls, they looked back at the city one last time. Babylon was still standing, its towers still scraped the sky. Its wealth was still staggering, but it was a ghost town inhabited by the living. Over the next 2 centuries, Babylon died the slow, agonizing death of irrelevance. The Persians moved the capital to Susa, then to Persepolis. The Euphrates shifted its course, moving away from the city walls as if disgusted by what it had witnessed. The great canals silted up. The mud brick, without constant maintenance, began to dissolve back into the earth from which it came. Alexander the Great would come later, trying to revive the corpse, trying to make Babylon the capital of his world empire. But he died in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, consumed by fever and alcohol, another victim of the cursed city. Finally, the silence won. The wind from the desert began to erode the names of the kings from the bricks. The shepherds used the royal bricks to build sheep pens. The glorious blue tiles of the Ishtar gate were buried under drifting sand. The city that had once said, "I am and there is no one else beside me," became a mound of dust. Today, the site of Babylon is a testament to the temporary nature of human power. The Saddam Hussein era attempted to rebuild it, stamping his own name on the new bricks next to Nebuchadnezzar's, a modern attempt at immortality that failed just as spectacularly. The lesson of October 12th, 539 BC, remains written not on plaster, but on the timeline of humanity. Security is an illusion. Wealth is a fog, and every empire, no matter how high its walls or how deep its rivers, is just one bad night away from being history. The end.